What killed Britain's fish and chip shops? That taste, that smell, that Friday ritual we'll likely never experience again. Close your eyes and you're there. 1975, vinegar-soaked newspaper warming your hands, golden batter cracking open to reveal soft, steaming flakes of cod. The streets thick with the unmistakable aroma of salt, vinegar, and hot beef dripping. Back then, Britain had 35,000 chippies, more than pubs, and they were the beating heart of every community. Many people point the finger at McDonald's, which opened in Britain in 1974, as the villain that destroyed the chippy. But what if the real culprit wasn't American at all? What if the thing that killed Britain's most beloved meal was something quiet, ordinary, and entirely British? Something so mundane that nobody noticed it erasing a way of life. Before we talk about the fall, we need to understand the rise, and the truth is, the story of fish and chips isn't as purely British as most people think. Fried fish arrived first, brought by Jewish immigrants from Portugal and Spain in the 17th century. They prepared pescado frito, fish lightly coated in flour and fried until golden, a tradition from the Iberian Peninsula that blended perfectly into the streets of London's East End. The chips came from somewhere else entirely. Historians still argue about whether they were invented in France or Belgium, but by the mid-19th century, fried potato chips were already spreading across England, especially in the industrial north where workers needed cheap, filling food they could eat on the move. Then, something magical happened. Those two foods met. Around 1860, Joseph Malin, a Jewish immigrant, opened a small shop in London's Bow District, selling fried fish and chips together for the first time. The idea was so perfect, so simple, that Malin's shop survived for more than a century, finally closing in the 1970s. Meanwhile, near Manchester, John Lees began selling the same winning combination from a wooden hut at the Moseley Market around 1863. Two men, working hundreds of miles apart, both saw the same thing before the rest of the country. Fried fish and chips together were destiny. The timing of their discovery couldn't have been better. Britain was booming with the Industrial Revolution. Cities were exploding with new workers pouring in from the countryside. People needed food that was hot, cheap, satisfying, and fast, food they could eat while walking home after a 12-hour shift. Fish and chips were the perfect answer. The North Sea trawling industry was exploding too. New steam-powered fishing vessels, first introduced in Leith in 1875, brought back massive catches of cod and haddock, delivered fresh in quantities Britain had never seen. Potatoes were cheap and abundant. Everything aligned at the perfect moment. By 1910, Britain had over 25,000 fish and chip shops. But they weren't just places to eat, they were pillars of their communities. Families who couldn't afford restaurants could still afford a few pennies for a hot meal. Chippy owners knew their customers by name, wrapped portions with practiced speed, and even extended credit to locals who had fallen on hard times. But it wasn't just convenience that turned fish and chips into a national treasure. It was war. When World War I began in 1914, the government had to decide what foods would be rationed. Fish and chips made the protected list. Prime Minister David Lloyd George understood that morale mattered almost as much as munitions. Families queuing outside chippies on Friday evenings represented a comforting sense of normal life in an abnormal world. During World War II, the government again protected fish and chips. Winston Churchill even called them the good companions because they kept British morale alive during the Blitz. Everything else, meat, eggs, bread, was rationed. But the chippy stayed open. George Orwell wrote in The Road to Wigan Pier that fish and chips were one of the few pleasures that kept working-class Britain from revolution. After the war, rationing dragged on until 1954, but fish and chips survived that as well. In fact, they thrived. They were a link to a pre-war world, a tiny luxury families could still afford, and a symbol of normal life in a country trying to rebuild itself. By the late 1920s, fish and chips hit their peak. 35,000 shops operating across Britain, one for every 1,000 people. Every town, every neighborhood, every high street had a chippy. For many, it wasn't just food, it was identity. And then came the decade that changed everything. The 1970s are remembered for power cuts, strikes, inflation, and chaos. But for fish and chip shops, the early 70s were a golden age. No one knew they were heading into a storm that would change British food forever. Prosperity had finally returned to working families after the long, thin post-war decades. People once again had money in their pockets, but not yet the dizzying number of choices that would soon crowd the British high street. And so, the chippy remained the default Friday night pilgrimage. It wasn't merely a place to eat. It was a ritual, one that shaped entire communities. Step inside a typical fish and chip shop in 1974, and you'd see something both familiar and impossibly distant. The shop was usually narrow, fluorescent lit, and already packed by late afternoon. On Fridays and Saturdays, queues snaked out the door, wrapping around the corner as families waited patiently for their weekly treat. Mothers wrote careful lists. Fathers queued with exact coins counted out. Children pressed their noses to the fogged-up glass, waiting for the moment when their dinner would be lifted, steaming, from the range. Behind the counter stood the heart of the operation, the frying range, huge, metallic, and roaring with heat. 2 or 3 deep fryers bubbled constantly, filled not with today's refined vegetable oils but with beef dripping, thick, rich, flavorful. Temperatures weren't measured with thermostats but with instinct. The best chip shop owners didn't need gadgets. They knew the temperature by the sound of the bubbling fat, by the shimmer on the surface, by the smell alone. It was a craft honed over decades. Inside the shop, windows steamed up instantly. The air was warm and thick, filled with the comforting scent of frying batter, fresh chips, and malt vinegar. But the magic wasn't just smell, it was precision. It was technique. It was tradition. Fish, usually cod or haddock, arrived that morning, gutted and filleted by suppliers who delivered daily. Every chippy had its own batter recipe, family secrets passed down through generations. Flour, water, maybe beer or baking soda, perhaps a splash of vinegar. Simple ingredients, but the proportions mattered. Good batter should be thin, crisp, golden, and never greasy. The moment you lifted the fish, it needed to crack open with a delicate shatter, revealing steaming white flakes inside. Chips were hand-cut every morning, usually from Maris Piper potatoes. Thick, uneven, full of character. Each chip was unique, impossible to replicate with today's factory-cut uniform sticks. You could bite into 10 different chips and each would taste slightly different, each fried to a perfect balance of soft inside and crispy outside. Then came the wrap, the ritual as sacred as the meal itself. First, the grease-proof paper. The chip shop owner's movements were fast and practiced. Chips were scooped into a perfect mound. The fish was lifted from the fryer, left to drain for precisely the right number of seconds, then laid carefully on top. Salt and vinegar? Always asked, never assumed. Then came the newspaper. Yesterday's Daily Mirror, Evening Standard, Sun, printed pages folded expertly around the meal. The paper insulated the food, keeping the heat in while absorbing excess oil. The moment you held that warm, slightly greasy package in your hands, the smell hit you. Malt vinegar, salt, hot fat, and fried potato, the unmistakable scent of British comfort. On cold evenings, especially in autumn and winter, that smell meant home. It meant family. It meant the end of the week and the beginning of the weekend. Chip shop owners were local celebrities. Many had Italian roots, families who had adopted and perfected the trade. Their hours were brutal. Lunch through the late evening, 6 days a week, often working behind the range until after the pubs closed. But the community knew them, relied on them, trusted them. Yet even in this golden age, the first tiny cracks had begun to form. Fish and chips were more than a meal. They were social architecture. They were the heartbeat of working-class Britain. Friday night meant fish and chips. It was a rhythm older than memory itself. Originally tied to Catholic meat-free Fridays, but eventually adopted by the entire nation. Religion no longer mattered. The tradition did. In seaside towns, the connection ran even deeper. Blackpool, Scarborough, Brighton, Great Yarmouth. These towns built entire industries around fish and chips. Day trippers would arrive by train, step onto the promenade, and immediately seek the nearest chippy. Families ate their meal on the seafront as gulls wheeled overhead, bold, aggressive, and part of the experience. The cries of seagulls mixing with the waves and the scent of salt air created memories that would last lifetimes. Seaside portions were always larger. The fish selection broader, plaice, skate, rock salmon, dishes rarely found inland. Children adored these trips, picking out their own meal, carrying the warm paper bundle with both hands, feeling the heat through the newspaper, eating straight from the paper, fingertips burning, vinegar stinging their nose. It was a rite of passage. And the tradition didn't end with childhood. Workers leaving the factory on Friday afternoon would walk straight to the chippy in groups. Teenage couples on early dates shared portions on their way home. Grandparents treated grandchildren, telling stories about how it was in their day. Fish and chips connected generations, each teaching the next the proper order. Salt first, then vinegar. Never the other way around. Regional quirks added even more identity. Mushy peas were a northern essential, thick, green, made from marrow-fat peas soaked overnight. Northerners loved them. Southerners mostly didn't understand them. Chip shops even had their own vocabulary, scraps or bits, The crispy batter fragments given free to kids who asked politely. In November 1974, something happened on a small street in Woolwich, southeast London, something that would quietly reshape British eating habits forever. A new restaurant opened on P Street, its bright yellow arches glowing like a beacon from another world. McDonald's had arrived. For London, it felt exotic, almost futuristic. Bright colors, shiny plastic seating, cheerful staff and crisp uniforms. The concept itself was strange to many. Walk up to a counter, order food, receive it within minutes and eat it quickly in a clean, casual space. Chip shops offered speed, but not this kind of speed. They delivered comfort, not this level of American efficiency. Americans living in Britain were the first to flock to it, traveling across the city just for the taste of a Big Mac, burger, fries and coffee for 50p. British customers looked on with curiosity, even suspicion. Everything at McDonald's was standardized. The weight of the burger, the size of the fries, the cooking time of every item. Nothing was left to instinct or experience. It was fast food engineered with clockwork precision. The expansion was swift. By 1977, 10 McDonald's restaurants dotted Britain. By 1985, nearly 200. Their strategy was simple: target families. Bright colors, friendly mascots, children's playgrounds, and the irresistible Happy Meal, food paired with a toy, something no traditional chippy could compete with. But McDonald's was only one wave in a larger invasion. Wimpy, the British burger chain, had already been around since the 1950s and was expanding aggressively by the 1970s. Kentucky Fried Chicken followed, introducing fried chicken buckets. Soon after, Burger King arrived. By the end of the decade, the British high street was transforming into something new and unfamiliar. Choice was exploding in a way the country had never seen. Even more disruptive were the Chinese takeaways. According to Hong Kong statistics, there were just 1,146 Chinese restaurants in the UK in 1970. By 1980, that number had risen dramatically. Britain's economic struggles in the 1970s actually helped these newcomers. As people tightened their budgets, immigrants from Hong Kong's new territories stepped in with affordable, flavorful meals that undercut traditional restaurants. Indian takeaways followed a similar path, especially near universities and in cities with growing South Asian communities. Soon, the British Friday night decision wasn't which chippy to go to, it was whether to have fish and chips, Chinese, Indian, or American fast food. The chippy's long-held monopoly was shattered. Inflation made everything worse. A portion of fish and chips that cost just 25p in 1970 had ballooned to 83p by 1980, a threefold increase. But rising prices weren't the real killer. A new threat emerged: regulation. In the early 1980s, a series of health and safety rules, many influenced by the European Union, targeted traditional chip shop practices. The most symbolic of these changes hit at the heart of the experience: the newspaper wrap. For generations, fish and chips had come bundled in yesterday's news, the print sometimes faintly visible through the greaseproof layer inside. Regulators declared the practice unsafe. Newspaper ink contained chemicals, possibly traces of heavy metals. Never mind that the food never touched the newspaper directly. Never mind that millions had eaten this way for decades without issue. The ruling was final: newspapers were banned. By the mid-1980s, shops were forced to switch to plain paper, blank newsprint, or worse, sterile, soulless polystyrene containers. The ritual of unfolding the paper to reveal your meal, the faint scent of ink mixing with vinegar, the way headlines appeared through warm grease stains, gone. Something intangible yet deeply meaningful vanished overnight. And the regulations didn't stop there. Old frying ranges had to be replaced with modern equipment. Temperature controls became mandatory. New ventilation systems were required. Compliance cost thousands. Money small family-run chippies simply didn't have. At the same time, fish prices were rising sharply. Cod stocks in the North Sea were collapsing after years of overfishing. European quotas reduced British trawler catches. Haddock, pollock, and frozen imports replaced fresh cod. Customers noticed the difference. Meanwhile, the world that had sustained chip shops was disappearing. Coal mines, steel mills, and shipyards, industries whose workers kept chippies busy every Friday, were closing one by one. Entire communities began to fracture. And the young people growing up in the 1980s and 1990s had different tastes. They were familiar with McDonald's, Indian curries, Chinese noodles, food their parents had never eaten. Even shopping changed. Late opening supermarkets meant families could buy frozen fish fingers and oven chips for a fraction of the price. Microwave ovens, rare in 1970, were in millions of homes by 1990. Ready meals replaced the weekly trip to the chippy. It wasn't any single cause that killed Britain's fish and chip shops. It was everything, coming at once. A perfect storm of cultural change, economic pressure, and regulatory burden. McDonald's gets most of the blame, and yes, American fast food accelerated the decline. But even without the golden arches, chip shops were in trouble. The ban on newspaper wrapping symbolized a much larger disappearance of tradition. Fish and chips wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual, a rhythm, and identity. Chinese and Indian takeaways offered variety, an entire world of flavors. A chip shop's menu couldn't compete. For some, fish and chips became old-fashioned or dull. Meanwhile, rising energy and labor costs crushed small businesses. Quality dropped in many shops as owners cut corners. Portions shrank. Fish got thinner. Oil was reused too many times. Customers noticed. And so, from a peak of 35,000 fish and chip shops in the 1920s, the number fell to just 11,000 by the early 2000s, a loss of 2/3. When your local chippy closed, it wasn't just a shop disappearing. It was a piece of Britain fading away, a connection to a way of life built on routine, community, and the comforting smell of vinegar on warm newspaper. We gained convenience. We gained choice. But somewhere along the way we lost something precious. If you're feeling nostalgic for the world that once was, don't miss the video on 17 old British shops that once ruled the high street.